very real sense, this is also the new year for the United Nations too. In the spirit of Tashlich, I hope we can cast away the distrust and disagreement of the past year. And as we look ahead, I encourage member states and all our partners to work together for the common good and a better world for all. Thank you very much.
My name is Tomas Sandell. I'm the founding director of European Coalition for Israel.
I'm Gregory Lafitte, the director for UN Affairs of the European Coalition for Israel.
And both of us are co-founders of the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy that we will be speaking about later in the program. But the topic for today is the United Nations. Last week, we spoke more generally about the work we do, about what we call the Great Pause, how we have been able to do our work during this very, during the COVID-19 pandemic. But today we're going to focus specifically on the work at the United Nations. That's a bit interesting, Gregory. We are called the European Coalition for Israel. As so many people would tell us, aren't there enough trouble in Europe? Why would we want to take on the whole world and involve the United Nations in our work? Gregory, how did this start?
Well, there's the EU delegation to the UN, so why not the European Coalition for Israel? No, I'm kidding. Well, it started about 10 years ago. Actually, it was following Sanremo, our 90th anniversary celebration of the Sanremo resolution. And there were discussions at the time of unilateral Palestinian statehood bid at the UN, and so this is when we believed it was a little bit that we had to do something about it. We had to go to the UN and warn about this unilateral move and discuss with the ambassadors there. Yeah, it feels like it was 20 years ago, but it was 10 years ago, I believe.
That's right. You mentioned unilateralism. Sorry, and we have again a situation where that topic is being brought up. Can you elaborate?
Yes, I think it's I mean. 10 years ago, when we came to the UN to warn about this unilateral move, I think many people agreed that it wasn't a good thing to do to have a unilateral move. I mean, one could say in a way that there's this warning. I think it's in the 1993 Vienna declaration against unilateral moves, and but today, when there are more unilateral moves, then everyone condemns those moves. When the U.S. president decided to move their embassy to Jerusalem, even if it's a decision, it's their decision. But people saw it as a unilateral move, and what is happening right now concerning this project of annexation, people see it as a unilateral move, but I don't think we hear we hear words of condemnation, but we didn't hear those words of condemnation then when there was this Palestinian unilateral move. So there's a little bit of I think a discrepancy in a way. I remember the words of Pope Benedict XVI, who said, "Choose the path of dialogue." So.
I was going to say that, Gregory, that I think we've been quite consistent in our messaging over these last 10 years. We've said that the only way that we can find a solution to the Middle East conflict is through direct negotiations. But as Ronald Reagan would say, it takes two to tango. So I think there's a responsibility of the international community to create an environment where the two parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians, would come together, would sit down and start talking to each other. Obviously, it's not a great distance from Ramallah to Jerusalem, and it seems a bit unnatural that they would have to go all the way to New York to talk to each other. So let's follow the example of Pope Benedict. I think that's a good way forward. The United Nations, generally speaking, may not have the best reputation, especially among friends of Israel. Do you think that this is a fair assessment of the work of the United Nations, or is there perhaps something to say to the credit of the work at the UN?
Yes, I think I have a view which is quite different from perhaps most of the people's view, because I have quite a positive view of the UN. I hear many people always criticizing the UN, saying that, thinking that it's the General de Gaulle called it le machin, and I think it was Ben Gurion who called it Shmum, which is means about the same thing. So people have a negative view of the UN, and there are some reasons for that, of course. But I would say there's a big difference between New York and Geneva. I mean, I'm originally from Geneva, so it's a bit hard for me to say that. But when you look at the General Assembly or Security Council, it's not the same thing than what is going on in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And there one can say that there is an obvious bias against Israel. It's even in the structure of in the agenda items. When you have one agenda item that excludes Israel or put the focus on Israel for its violation of human rights, I think that's a problem.
Mm. It's true, and maybe it's worth mentioning even at the start that from the very beginning we had a constructive approach to the work at the United Nations, and perhaps that is also why we have succeeded to the extent that we can say that we've seen some real achievements over the years. And I think that's, I hope something that would characterize the work of the European Coalition for Israel, both when it comes to any given international organization we want to engage constructively. And certainly that has been the case with the UN in New York. Another connection to United Nations is actually the Durban Conference of 2001. ECI was officially founded only in 2003, but on a personal level, I made a commitment, interestingly, in September 2001 or I saw the need for such an organization. Mm-hmm. When I speak about September 2001, what does this bring to mind, Gregory?
Well, it brings to mind a number of things, obviously, but this conference on racism in Durban was I think it's really important to look back at what happened there. It's certainly not the moment. We don't really have the time to go through everything that happened there, but there were very clear, unfortunately, anti-Semitic arguments that were brought up, that were in the discussions. There were even, it was a pro-Palestinian organization who was distributing this anti-Semitic forgery, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, distributing it to the delegates of the conference. And one may think, how is this even possible? This is a conference against racism, and they're raising up some anti-Semitic ideas. How is this even possible? It's something that I know that you and I have been a lot, thinking about all these years, and even before the Durban Conference. And I must say that my eyes opened up when I started studying works, for example, of Jean-Claude Milner, who tried to see, why is it that every time we try to do something that is universal, then the Jews are always excluded from that? I don't want to take too much time on this, but he wrote this text that I have just here that I like. I'll just read it very quickly and explain. Par leurs rites et leurs coutumes, les Juifs empêchent qu'on puisse traiter de manière consistante de tous les hommes. So we cannot, when we're talking about all all of humankind, the customs of the Jews don't make it possible. Ils rendent impossible l'emploi de l'opérateur tout. The quantifier for all is impossible when with the Jewish people. When we're talking, quand il s'agit des êtres humains, when we're talking about all of humanity. À la lettre, literally, tous les hommes n'existent pas, à moins que pour sauver l'opérateur tout, on ne mette les Juifs en exception. So he's saying literally, if we want to be able to talk about all of humanity, use the quantifier for all, for the humanity, then we have to exclude the Jews. And so for the fight against racism and against anti-Semitism, it just shows, and we could enter in more depth of why this is like that, but it's impossible to mix the two. And unfortunately, we see it even now with what is going on. Every time when people want to fight racism globally, universally, and include the Jews, the Jewish people in that this racism, in this fight against this racism, then either you do something a bit specific for the Jewish people, or you will end up with some anti-Semitism. So that's why I think we cannot mix those two fights. We have to fight racism, and we have to fight anti-Semitism, but we cannot mix the two.
And that's very interesting, and this also brings us back to UN General Assembly Resolution 3379. Zionism is racism, and this is something that keeps popping up. It came back, this is from 1975, if I remember correctly, yes. And then it came back in 2001 in Durban, and we hear it again today. Zionism is racism, and do you have anything to add here? I mean, when we say Zionism, of course, maybe we need to define the right for the self-determination of Jewish people. Is racism, and that's quite that's a harsh statement.
Well, I think it's fair to say that at the UN, unfortunately, I'm afraid that many ambassadors are not aware that this resolution has been, what do you say, repealed. So that's quite sad. What I understand, it was thanks to the Americans that it was repealed, but it was done because of the discussions for Camp David, for the Camp David Accords, and it was to lead there to that peace treaty that those accords that the Israelis asked for the U.S. to pressure the UN on this. But I think in a way that those were terrible times, and at the same time it was it was really the moment at the UN. We still look back to the speeches of Herzog and Moynihan, and we will not acquiesce, was those words again, I have them just here. The United States does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. And of course also the speech of Chaim Herzog. Unfortunately, we see this idea that Zionism is racism coming back all the time. And I know that it's part, unfortunately, of the Palestinian program, diplomatic program, that they keep on trying to bring it back to the table. But I think this is really somehow the core of our work has been to show how much Zionism has nothing to do with racism. it's quite the contrary, and that Zionism is something beautiful, and we can see it by seeing all the contributions that the Jewish people brought. I'm joining this webinar from Basel, so I think we here in Basel people know a thing or two about Zionism. And I mean, I'm glad we can talk about it today. But when we see this battle against Zionism, in a way, it's as the French President Macron understood. It's the same thing than the fight against the Jews. I mean, it's anti-Semitism. It's nothing. It's just another form of anti-Semitism.
We're going shortly to move forward in the discussion, but I still just want to come back to it was repelled, if I'm not mistaken, was it in 1990 or
1991? Yes.
91. So this is, of course, the time of the fall of the Iron Curtain, and I was a young student back in Finland at that time, and of course this was when everything changed. And I think there's also a lesson to be drawn by the fact that this resolution was backed by the Soviet Union and the whole communist bloc. And once the Iron Curtain fell, and you had the freedom of all these countries from Poland to Bulgaria, Romania, they took a very different line on this issue. And today, even within the EU, but also at the UN, they would be some of the strongest supporters of Israel as a nation state, because they know the totalitarian conviction that this was like the root of all evil. So I'm just mentioning this as a side note, but looking more constructive perhaps, because we are aware of the problems. How are we fighting anti-Semitism around the world and at the United Nations?
Well, many times when we hear about anti-Semitism, there are many people preach for more tolerance, saying that this is what we need tolerance. We realized early on that that's not exactly what we want. I mean, tolerance is clearly not enough. You tolerate something bad, but you don't tolerate the Jewish people or the Jewish culture. And we also hear that the best way to fight anti-Semitism is education. And I think that's true. That's absolutely true. It's education is key. And the other day I was looking into that, and I saw that in Hebrew, education is the word for education, according to Rashi. I mentioned Rashi a number of times in our discussions, and again, it's this very impressive rabbi, impressive by the number of commentaries that he wrote on the Bible, on the Torah, on the Tanakh. Today, any person studying the Bible, the first question that they'll ask is, what has Rashi said about that verse? And Rashi, this rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived in Troyes, en Champagne, he in the 11th century. He wrote some commentaries on education. So we're talking about education, and he said that it's what it really means in Hebrew is to introduce someone to something. So it's introduce the core ideas. The interesting thing is that he wrote this in the French of the time. I mean, Champenois, the French of the time, but he wrote it in Hebrew letters because then the only written language was Latin. So it's why some say that Rashi introduced the French written language, but with Hebrew letters. So that's an interesting thing in itself. But so this word has the same root in Hebrew than chanak, which means to taste. And so somehow what I think we're doing is give a taste of the Jewish culture, of the Jewish thought. And this is what we've been doing at the UN, is trying to to somehow show what are the ways of the Jewish people, of the Jewish history, and the Jewish thought through a lot of the holidays. So we've worked quite a lot on making known a bit more what is Yom Kippur, and having Yom Kippur recognized as a UN official holiday, but also other known or less known holidays like Tashlir, with both Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time and the Secretary General, the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and also Passover, where Passover there's a clear universal message that everyone understands.
If I can come in here and say, you mentioned the word taste, and that can be taken literally in this respect.
Yes, exactly.
As you know, most events have been either luncheons, we had breakfast, we haven't had any dinners, but certainly luncheons. And I think there is a beauty, and there's something very appealing to bringing people together and break bread.
Yes.
To also meet in this context of learning new things. And I still remember the first event we had in connection with Yom Kippur, and how we could illustrate, because we would always say, well, how are these principles, how can they be illustrated in what's the relevance for international relations, and Yom Kippur, as we said so many times, this great day of reconciliation. And that time, you will remember, we had two examples which I think are worth mentioning. One is, of course, what we've seen in Europe, this you know, almost unprecedented reconciliation that took place after the war between France and Germany in particular. And then we had the ambassador from Rwanda talking about reconciliation in a very more recent history with the genocide in Rwanda. And I think since this was, my recollection, was it the first event we had, it really gave a taste from the very beginning that, you know, this is profound, this is beyond the political jargon at the UN. And also it tastes good, you know, diplomats, they like to sit down.
Yeah, that was very remarkable. That I think one of the first events, it wasn't the first, but one of the first events we done there was on Yom Kippur, but it was a breakfast. Yom Kippur, which is a bit ironic, but it wasn't on Yom Kippur, of course, but it was concerning Yom Kippur, and as you just said, it was about, you know, showing what are what is the real meaning behind Yom Kippur, because we were trying to see how to make Yom Kippur a UN official holiday. But I thought it was important not only to go in that direction, but also to explain why it's such an important day. The UN recognizes a number of, you know, there are so many international days of this and that, and there are a number of UN official holidays. But to have, I think that there's a strong message in Yom Kippur for the UN, and as the book of Jonah is the one read on Yom Kippur, I particularly like Yom Kippur.
Yeah. Last time you grabbed a book unannounced, and I'm going to grab a book here as well. This is something that I quoted at that Yom Kippur breakfast, if we wish. And it will lead us into the next subject, which has to do with cultural diplomacy, and especially the many contributions of the Jewish people. This is a book by Thomas Cahill, The Gift of the Jews. It was a bestseller some 20 years ago. And the first paragraph starts like this. The Jews started it all, and by it, I mean so many of the things we care about. The underlying values that make all of us, Jew and Gentile, believer and atheist, tick. Without the Jews, we would see the world through different eyes, hear with different ears, even feel with different feelings. And not only would our sensorium, the screen through which we receive the world, be different, we would think with a different mind, interpret all our experience differently, draw different conclusions from the things that befall us, and we would set a different course for our lives.
Wow.
And this is in a nutshell also what I think what we mean when we say the Jewish contributions go so much deeper. But how would you explain this cultural diplomacy, more broadly speaking? Because we say the work we do at the United Nations, and maybe we should mention this here, I think this is a fruitful approach. We so often get trapped in a territorial conflict, and we have to be on either side. And it's a lot about strategy, tactics, law, but it's so much deeper. How would you illustrate this or define cultural diplomacy?
Well, first of all, I think cultural diplomacy is showing the importance of culture. I think that's the first thing. It's showing the role of culture, and a lot could be said on this, but concerning the Jewish culture, and I'll come back to this notion of the importance of culture. But concerning the Jewish culture, I think it has so much. I mean, as Tomas described, it has so much to offer to the world. It has offered already a lot, but it's important to even see today the lessons that we can derive from a lot of the Jewish culture. I could give, I was thinking about it the other day, that with this whole situation today with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think one of the contributions of the Jewish culture is a warning. To societies that are controlled a bit too much by scientific or technical considerations. When the medical experts and sometimes tend to forget that the medicine is not an exact science. When we start having our societies governed by medical experts, which has been the case, unfortunately, these past months, I think we're entering in a difficult situation, and this is one of the warnings from the lessons of the Jewish culture. To define it, I would say that it's really a dialogue. It's this cultural diplomacy. Diplomacy, there are different interpretations of the etymology of the diplomacy, but it just means double in a way. It means that so some say they have double language, but I don't think that's a positive way of looking at it. But I prefer to see it as a dialogue, as an understanding. When in Hebrew, bina, it means it has to be between two worlds. It cannot just be, you're not just yourself and you understand. No, you have to understand. You have to have a dialogue with someone else. You have to go towards someone else. And when you look at our Western civilization, I think it's important to point out that there are two main sources of our Western civilization. And of course, there are some others, but those are the two main. And the two main are the Jewish source and the Greek source. We usually recognize the Greek source. It's certainly more obvious sometimes. I mean, most of the time it's more obvious to everyone. But the Jewish source is there too, and it's important to I think to continue this dialogue between the Jewish and the Greek source. Some would say that on one hand you have a view of finiteness on the Greek side, and of infinite, the infinite on the Jewish side, a tragical reason on the Greek side, and hope on the Jewish side. But I'd like to point out that when you're in a finite world, it's really hard to realize that your world is finite. It's hard to see. You could believe that it's infinite. But it's only through this dialogue with another world where infinity exists by itself, contrary to what Aristotle thought, that you can realize, oh, I am living in a finite world. And I think it's this dialogue. So it's not just that one supersedes the other. It's really this dialogue between the finite and the infinite, between between those two sources and those two cultures. If I may, I'll talk about Rashi again. Rashi explained that art, which appears probably for the first time of the writings of humanity in the Bible, in this verse describing certainly one of the first artists of humanity, Bezalel, which actually means in the shadow of God. So it gives, according to me, a good definition what art is. It's really a projection, some kind of a finite projection of the infinite, finite projection of God. He describes art with this word which means weaving. And it means a number of things. It means art, it means weaving, but it's really, he talks about a weaving. I mean, it's the Bible, the verse talking about a weaving of weavings, but it can be translated also thought of thoughts. And so Rashi explains that it's this weaving where on one side you have an image, on the other side you have another image. Instead, on one side you have the image of a lion, which symbolizes Judaism. And on the other side, you have an image of the eagle, which symbolizes the nations. So it's the dialogue between the two. And this is what we're trying to do with our cultural diplomacy. It's this dialogue or these interlocutions between the Jewish world, the Jewish thought, and the Greek source.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that this year will mark the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. And of course, when we look back at what the world looked like, international community 75 years ago, it was quite different from today, both in terms of numbers of UN member states, but also the dominating cultures, and you may say even political cultures. If we simplify, we can say in 75 years ago, those who made up the founding members of the UN were basically more or less stable parliamentary democracies, with a few exceptions. Of course, we had the Soviet Union, and I don't think we want to go as far as call it a parliamentary democracy. But again, the worldview 75 years ago, and those nations in particular who took the view, wouldn't you say that they were more familiar perhaps with Judeo, if you want to call it the Judeo-Christian worldview? And this is something which is illustrated again in this Isaiah wall in New York, just right across from the headquarters, when the United Nations in a way is trying to define its ultimate goal. And they quote Isaiah 2 about this time where swords will be turned into plowshares. But is it so that throughout the years, and perhaps especially in the 70s, when we had this very strong reaction against anything to do with a Jewish source calling Zionists for racism, that there was a backlash? Do you see any? Where are we today? And is there any, are you optimistic that there could be a renaissance and the nations would go back and say, well, listen, we need to study these sources more closely?
I would say yes, perhaps because I'm a bit too optimistic by nature, but or am I? I don't know. But I would say there are a few things historically in a way that can encourage us. First, you mentioned this verse on the wall in front of the UN. As you know, they first it was just a verse, and then people in the Jewish community in New York said, "Come on, who wrote this? You have to quote the say who it is." So they finally added Isaiah just below. But one interesting fact is that there's this very interesting statue in the UN garden, a rose garden, behind the UN Secretariat building, where the statue represents this verse of turning swords into plowshares. And you know who gave that to the
I know.
statue? It's the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union. I think it's in 1950, if I'm not mistaken. And so when you think about this, you think, yeah, there is hope, because even if the Soviet Union could recognize the importance of this vision of world peace through a verse in the prophet Isaiah, I think I think that there is hope, because if the Soviet Union is capable of recognizing this, I think many nations are. But I see more and more enthusiasm and honest interest in learning those ways of the Jewish people, as it is written actually in the same verse in Isaiah. So there, I think that we see more and more of that interest. I mean, not only in our events. Every time we've had those, for example, those Passover setters, we had around 80 nations represented, 70 to 80 nations represented, and it's clear that people are interested not only in the history, but also in the philosophical ideas behind the Jewish culture. So I think there's a lot that can be done with cultural diplomacy. As you know, we've had many discussions with the former Deputy Secretary General on the importance of cultural diplomacy, and we were quite inspired by what he did himself 5 years ago with this event of bringing together classical music and readings of this book of Dag Hammarskjöld. And we tried to follow a little bit this example with the first event almost a month ago, but we're planning other events in that direction. I believe there's a lot that can be done through this dialogue between cultures. I mean, those really interlocutions between cultures, between the Jewish culture and other cultures, but also between different expressions of art.
Maybe we should also mention in this context that you mentioned former Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson, but another very decisive discussion that we've had that really led us in this direction was with senior official at the European Commission. Maybe not mention his name, but just to say that he was senior then, and he's perhaps even more senior today. When we sat down and we had a general discussion, and he came up with the idea, and he said, well, wouldn't it be interesting to have this alliance of nations which host or have hosted a Jewish community at some point in history, and we counted number of nations perhaps around 120. And I think this is also a different way of looking at Jewish contributions to our society. And I think there is not this is in no way distancing from the Jewish state, because I think on the contrary, it gives more context to understanding what the Jewish people can and will contribute to their whole society, but also what the Jewish people through the Jewish state, modern state of Israel, have contributed, can contribute. So I think this is all something that people appreciate, I would say, a very positive, out-of-the-box approach, not get stuck in the conflict, but just to try to give some context, some background, and taste a good meal, yes. as you said.
Yes, and what you just said made me think of two examples where we see the application of the idea of education according to Rashi, of being introduced to some ideas, and in some not obvious places. For example, I don't think I can mention which nation this is, but there was a Muslim nation not so long ago where their president decided to host some Hanukkah receptions every year. And by the way, it's the same Hanukkah is the same root of Hanak, it's the same root of dedicate to be introduced to education, and I think there it's really key to do such a thing. And I know that currently at the UN there is one of the permanent representatives from an Arab country who was actually educated in Jewish studies. And I think it gives the right perspective, and from there there's a discussion and a study that can happen, and I think there's a lot of hope.
Yeah, we have given people an opportunity to send in questions. So perhaps before we go into the questions, do you still have any closing remark on cultural diplomacy and the work at the UN, or?
Well, yeah, I had thought of a text that I wanted to read. I like to read text every time. I had thought of this text of Rousseau, which illustrates very much everything we just said. But I'm probably not going to read it all. Un spectacle étonnant et vraiment unique est de voir un peuple expatrié n'ayant plus ni lieu ni terre depuis près de 2000 ans, un peuple altéré, chargé, mêlé d'étrangers depuis plus de temps encore, un peuple épars, dispersé sur la terre, asservi, persécuté, méprisé de toutes les nations, conserver pourtant ses coutumes, ses lois, ses mœurs, son amour patriotique et sa première union sociale, quand tous les liens en paraissent rompus. Les Juifs nous donnent cet étonnant spectacle. The Jews give us this very spectacular show, in a way. I promise that I'll put some translation, some subtitles. I did last time when I read the text in French. But the French have the Security Council presidency right now, and everything is done in French. So I think that's why we need to.
And this is a native. From Geneva as well. So.
Yes, and I'm quoting exactly, quoting Jean-Jacques Rousseau from Geneva. So, les Juifs nous donnent cet étonnant spectacle. Les lois de Solon, de Numa, de Lycurgue sont mortes. Celles de Moïse, bien plus antiques, vivent toujours. Athènes, Sparte, Rome ont péri et n'ont plus laissé d'enfants sur la terre. Sion détruite n'a point perdu les siens. Ils se conservent, ils multiplient, s'étendent par tout le monde et se reconnaissent toujours. Bon, I'm just skipping a little bit. And de tous les systèmes de législation qui nous sont connus, nul, excepté celui-là, n'a subi toutes les épreuves et n'y a toujours résisté. Tout homme, quel qu'il soit, il doit reconnaître une merveille unique dont les causes divines ou humaines méritent certainement l'étude et l'admiration des sages, préférablement à tout ce que la Grèce et Rome nous offrent d'admirable en fait d'institutions politiques et d'établissements humains. So what Rousseau is saying is that every man, every human being should be in awe in front of this contribution, which is unique, and that merits that deserves the study and the admiration even more than anything that Greece and Rome has contributed. So this is,
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I think the discoveries that you made in literature about these issues, and anti-Semitism on the one hand, but also the positive side, affirming the contributions, are quite remarkable, and we will continue on that path. Wonderful. There is a question which is very ambitious and broad. Can the UN be reformed?
Well, I think when you look at the history of the UN, actually, it kept on being reformed. I mean, that's what the UN does. It's reformed all the time. When you look at the official languages of the UN, things have evolved quite a bit along the years. When you look at the UN official holidays, and Yom Kippur is an example. But yes, I want to come back to that. When we started talking about the importance of having Yom Kippur recognized as an official UN holiday, there were two reactions. The first reaction was, yes, it's obvious. Why didn't we do it? Everyone in New York knows what Yom Kippur is. The children don't go to school because it's Yom Kippur, but it's only the UN who didn't know what Yom Kippur was in New York. And so it was a bit obvious to everyone. But the second reaction was a bit, oh yes, but it's so difficult to add another holiday. But when we look at how things happen, the discussions, etc., I think it's a good example of how a reform can happen. There was, I think, a good willingness. There was some opposition, but in a way, it helped other nations also. It helped others who had not been able to have their holiday recognized, and through this initiative, they were able to get the attention of everyone on the importance of their holidays.
What I would point out is also that I think as friends of Israel, sometimes we tend to become automatically critical of the UN, but we don't. I think the enemies of Israel have used the UN structures much more effectively than the friends have, and we cannot blame the structure. No. For the unwillingness, I think, of good people, of friends of the Jewish people and of Israel to really engage. So I think,
and I think it's important to say that when we, sorry for interrupting, when we started the initiative talking about it with the UN Secretariat, from the beginning, we had the very positive response from the UN Secretariat. They wanted to do everything they could to help. And to make it happen, it's always the same thing at the UN. You need the support of the UN member states. Yeah. So it just means the UN Secretariat just understood that it was something that was fair. It should have been done a number of years ago, and so they tried to help us and everyone else working together, and especially the Israeli permanent mission to the UN in New York to help us to make it a reality.
Yeah. Maybe I need to add just to clarification that we work very closely together and are very good friends with all the large Jewish organizations in New York, be it the American Jewish Committee, David Harris, or World Jewish Congress, Ambassador Lauder, or the Malcolm Hoenlein, or the organization of presidents of major Jewish organizations, and there are others. and I think, but always what we do bring to the table is the uniqueness. Here we are, an organization which is not exclusively, it's not Jewish, and we're coming from Europe. That which sometimes can come across as a weakness really becomes our strength, because we are so unexpected. I mean, you're half French, half Swiss, I'm Finnish, and here we come up in travel all the way to New York and say, why on earth would you do this? Mm-hmm. And this gives us then a platform. There is a question about UNESCO. I think there was a lot of criticism a few years ago towards UNESCO and certain resolutions which would put into question Jewish presence in Israel. And there is a question to say that how are things with UNESCO now, because it's been a bit quiet over the last 2 years, perhaps.
Yes, well, I think there are a number of misconceptions, if I may say, concerning UNESCO, concerning those resolutions. I heard many people criticize UNESCO because of this decision. I don't think it's correct to do that, because it's of course it's this decision of the member states of the executive committee of UNESCO. It's not a decision of UNESCO by itself, and certainly the leaders of that time, UNESCO, I don't think they were quite in favor of that resolution. And even this, if I'm not mistaken, the former Secretary General of the UN at the time, Ban Ki-moon, had said that this resolution was unfortunate. So I think it's fair to say that it wasn't really a decision of UNESCO. I think if we need to blame someone, it's the member states who decided to vote for such a resolution, or the ones who also brought it up and submitted the ones that put it in blue as the UN.
I think that's a good point to differentiate, and this is a bit educational as well. I'm a student in international relations, and so you end up having a situation where you can have the Director General Irina Bokova at the time of UNESCO. She worked very closely with us in Europe. She sent us a wonderful message to one of our annual conferences, explaining the importance of affirming a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. But Gregory, as you say, she's the Director General. This is a democratically elected organization. So you then have a number of member states that come together, yes, and issue something as ridiculous, let's face it, as they came up with. The problem is, and I think here again, and maybe that's the topic for another webinar, I think the European nations often would be a little bit passive. They wouldn't vote they wouldn't support these resolutions, but they would then they wouldn't vote. They wouldn't vote yes or no. They would abstain. And I think here we have to, as citizens here in Europe, we have to demand more of our governments. You cannot just abstain if you realize that this is completely crazy. You have to react. You just cannot abstain. Yes. So I think the address goes to our national capitals.
Yes.
Final question. I mentioned this will mark the 75th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations. And still this month, we will celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Charter, mm-hmm, of the United Nations. It's amazing. I think for the last 9 years, Gregory, we've been going to New York for the high-level week, where you have all the world leaders coming together. And we had a number of very interesting meetings during that week. It's a paradox in a way that when everyone's been waiting for this big party, the big 75, and now we are in this situation, what is going to happen? How will the UN celebrate its 75th anniversary?
Well, we don't know yet for sure, but it looks like it's going to be like the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. So this date this anniversary is on the 26th of June, so in 2 weeks from now, and it has been decided that everything will be virtual. It will be a virtual celebration, and yes, there have been many preparations, and I think it's quite a celebration to celebrate the 75th anniversary of such an organization. It looks like the UN the UNGA general debate, so the high level week, which is supposed to be the last week of September, is also going to take place a bit virtually, not entirely virtually, of what I understand. There seems like every nation will be represented by just one delegate, so their permanent representative, and all the heads of state or government will send their remarks, their address to the General Assembly by video. And in advance of what I understand, that is what is planned, which is quite particular. I'm sure you remember that a strange situation happened a few years ago when the whole week was moved completely, almost at the last minute. So there's been some strange situations in the past, but it's true that this year things are going to be quite different. And I think in a way it opens opportunities to do other things, to do things a bit differently. It's been a bit difficult at the UN. For everyone complains a bit about this high-level week because there's so many things stuffed in the week. There are so many. The agenda is more than full. There's so many meetings, so many side events. It's impossible to do anything. And I think by doing it virtually, perhaps it will be easier to do more things, and where people can somehow attend several conflicting side events. There's always been the discussion. I mean, there's for quite a number of years now, discussion of having a second moment in the year, second high-level week in the year. Sometimes I mean, people were talking about the spring, to do it in spring, and so it's also one of the possibilities to postpone the high-level week to the spring.
I think one category of people that will be very happy are the residents of New York, or Manhattan, I should say, when for once, you know, all of Manhattan will not be blocked up and traffic will be jammed.
Yeah, well, perhaps with all this those difficult times, perhaps the New Yorkers are now wishing for the UNGA to.
There we go. Well, we said earlier that maybe this time we would have time to. We would have the resources to book a decent hotel, because that's another thing that it's impossible to get a decent hotel room during that week, and the price would skyrocket, and of course this year there won't be, you know, hardly anyone there. So it remains to be seen exactly what we will do, but we will of course mark this event in our own way. We are coming to a close, Gregory, and maybe we should just announce before we log off that next week, the same time, we will have a new webinar. We will bring in one or two guests, Andrew Tucker, international lawyer, who many of you know and have worked closely together with us for many years. We will together discuss the, as we said last week, the elephant in the room, that issue that everyone is concerned with now, the so-called annexation of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, the Jordan Valley, to see where we are at next week. We may also bring in a member of European Parliament to get a perspective from the EU. But that's our program for next week. Gregory, do you want to say something about the week after, which is actually, which will be on a Friday and the day of the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter?
Yes, we will have in 2 weeks from now, so a little bit more, I think 2 weeks from now, on the 26th of June. So we have invited the Germany's federal commissioner for Jewish life in Germany and to fight anti-Semitism, Dr. Felix Klein. Who has agreed in participating in the same kind of webinar, in the discussion with us on anti-Semitism, but also on cultural diplomacy, and a little bit along the lines of this today's webinar, but discussing with him how Germany is involved in this cultural diplomacy and what we can do together. So. Yeah, I think I'm excited that we'll be able to have this discussion with him.
And we should mention that Germany, of course, will take a very special role starting the 1st of July, when they will take the presidency of the European Union. And at the same time, they are now one of the non-permanent.
The presidency of the Security Council in July also.
Yeah. So all eyes on Germany, and we will be able to dialogue and discuss with one of the most central policymakers when it comes to the issues that are important for us all. So again, we thank you for having tuned in. And we're looking forward to your, if you have comments, please feel free to send them in to us. And we are looking forward to see you again next week. Thank you.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such. Thank you, Mr. President.